So one of the key things you could be asked in an exam is how far was the tension under either James or Charles's reigns, or a combination of the two, due to finances. Now, this would be incorporated to any question regarding tension between the Crown and Parliament. It would just be the focus of the factor in the question you're given with which to assess. So if you've got something as finances, this is going to be the main drive of your argument. If you have a question on was religion the main source of tension, you would obviously include finance to either be more or less important against religion as a factor. Now, the Crown had historically been dependent on Parliament and thereby the political nation, because the political nation is the bridge between Parliament, the bridge between Crown and the commoners, so the gentry and the nobility, to raise funds, especially during times of war. Parliament restricted the methods in which the Crown could raise funds in order to prevent absolutism. So in order to kind of create taxes or gain revenue, those types of acts, so financial acts, had to go through Parliament. If the Crown tried to gain money through any other avenue, that would be deemed to be an illegal method with which they would use to gain revenue, and therefore Parliament would be concerned and rightfully annoyed about that, because they see that as absolutism, and therefore that depletes their role within politics, because Parliament's role is to support and advise the monarch as well as to provide taxes and revenue. As a result of inherited debts from the Tudor period and inflation from the previous monarch, the Crown were restricted in their foreign policy aims, so how they pursued wars and conflicts and relations with countries abroad, and ability to govern due to restricted finances. So under Stuart Britain, the government in particular, or Parliament, were very keen to kind of reduce that extravagance that was seen under the Tudor period, to try and reduce the financial deficit within the country. The Crown had to experiment with new ways of gaining revenue when forced loans were disapproved by Parliament, particularly during times of war. This became a mass source of tension during the Stuart era. Now, there are differing types of tension, financial tension, between the two crowns, between James and Charles. A lot of James's financial tension is over eradicating his debt. Charles's trouble over finances is due to wars that he wishes to become involved in, or with which he wants to pursue. So the type of financial strain is different between the two monarchs. Now, James signs the Treaty of London in 1604, and this officially ends England's war with Spain and thus reduced Crown expenditure. However, James was very extravagant, and court spending in the years 1603 to 25 was double what it had been under Elizabeth, bearing in mind that Elizabeth was the longest reigning monarch by this point. So in 1606, Parliament granted 3 subsidies. So a subsidy is a loan amount. So one subsidy equals approximately £70,000, which, if you bear in mind that the annual income of a gentry member was £2 per year, you can foresee how much debt and how much money is being accrued within the Stuart government. So Parliament in 1606, so 3 years into James's reign, grant 3 subsidies to help him with his debts, but right away he gave £44,000 of what is £210,000 to 3 of his Scottish friends. This made Parliament reluctant to grant further subsidies. So out of £210,000, he has given £44,000 of this away to 3 friends, with no particular financial reasoning behind it. And this makes Parliament reluctant to grant further money to him, because they are already faced with a deficit, a debt from the Tudor period, and this has only been enhanced on by James. Now, James was granted a £100,000 loan from London in 1610, but upon dissolving Parliament in 1611, James looked into other methods of raising revenue, because Parliament said, we will offer you this £100,000 loan to reduce or eradicate your debts. After that, we will not be granting any further subsidies unless it's to do with conflict, which is unavoidable. So James's Parliament of 1621. So we have a 10-year period whereby James does not call Parliament. And this meant that he had called Parliament in 1621 over the issue of money due to the escalation of the 30 Years' War in Europe. Now, the 30 Years' War had started in 1618 of what is now modern-day Germany. So for a period of 3 years, Britain has managed to maintain its neutrality. However, James does want to become involved in the 30 Years' War because, don't forget, one of his daughters is married to a German prince, which is where this war is located. Now, he asked Parliament for more money, but as you can understand, Parliament has not been called for 10 years, and Parliament only granted 2 subsidies. So this is about £140,000, and refused to grant more until James heard Parliament's concerns, i.e. they're not happy over monopolies, they're not happy about not being called for 10 years, and there's a period of economic depression. So they want to voice their concerns of any further taxes being granted would have a negative implication on society. This combined with bad harvests in 1623 to 24 further weakened the Crown's finances because we now don't have products with which to trade with because they've been destroyed by the bad harvest, which were reflected then in the calling of Parliament again in 1624. So 2 statutes weakened the Crown's powers. So this is now a reduction of the monarchy's power. So we firstly have the Subsidy Act. The Act granted a further £300,000 for war, bearing in mind they already granted £140,000 3 years prior to this, on the condition that it be used for specific areas of foreign policy and that this spending would be overseen by parliamentary officials. So this is then reducing James's likeliness to give an odd 40 grand to his friends, that any money they are giving him is being put to good use. But this challenge of monarchy power doesn't go down well with James, given that he believes he's been put there by God, the whole concept of divine right of kings. They also want to limit the Crown's right to grant monopolies to individuals. And again, this is seen by James as an infringement on his royal prerogative. And that creates further tension between Crown and Parliament. Bearing in mind that James dies in 1625, so the 1624 Parliament is the last time that James negotiates with Parliament, but we do see a massive reduction in the power that he is able to exercise before his death. Now, James does attempt to reform and raise money in his reign. So we have 2 incidents within 1608, so he's been in power for 5 years. We have something called the Book of Rates. Now, this listed the official valuations of those items on which customs duty should be paid. So impositions became worth £70,000 per year. That was the equivalent of a parliamentary subsidy. So the Book of Rates was a way of James gaining revenue without having to go to Parliament to request for further money. However, although he was gaining £70,000 from impositions and taxes and customs duties, this could not keep up with inflation, so inevitably he still had to go back to Parliament for further money. But the Book of Rates challenged parliamentary rights over taxation, and that meant that they weren't happy because it then brought into question the Crown's need for Parliament and could they be dissolved permanently. Likewise, in the same year, we have something called the Book of Bounty, and this is a survey on Crown land. So this is land owned by the monarchy, which they generally either sell off or they rent out. And the book is reviews the leasing policy to raise further revenue. So basically they increase the rental on the monarchy's lands, which obviously isn't popular, but it is a way of gaining further revenue. Now, the biggest attempt by James to raise revenue is something called the 1610 Cecil's Great Contract. So Robert Cecil declared the Crown debt was £280,000 and that their annual expenditure was £511,000, so just over £500,000. Again, put into context, the gentry only earns £2 per year, so you can see how excessive this is. Now, Cecil had hoped to shock MPs into granting a subsidy of £600,000 to pay off James's debts. But Parliament only offered £200,000 in exchange for James to give up his rights on wardship and impositions. Now, wardship is the land that is owned by juveniles. The Crown takes ownership over their land until they become of age. Now, Parliament want this to end because they are concerned that James would sell this land off before these juvenile potential property owners are able to reclaim their land. The contract, however, collapsed due to distrust between Parliament and Crown. On the one hand, Parliament are angered by this contract because they see it as excessive. They see it as James wanting to manipulate the financial situation in his favour. James is angered, though, because obviously he sees it as Parliament wanting to massively reduce his royal power. And as a result of that, James dissolves Parliament in 1611, and it's not called again for a further 10 years until 1621. Now, in contrast, we have to bear in mind that there is a domino effect with Charles's finances because he is inheriting the financial problems from his father. Now, Charles adopted an anti-Spanish campaign due to his failed Spanish match and his marriage alliance to Henrietta Maria of France, who had been long-standing enemies with Spain. Spain and France have always had a very long-term rivalry, and this proved to be costly because he wanted to financially support the Dutch. Now, the Netherlands was a colony which belonged to Spain at this time, and therefore England were very keen to kind of disrupt Spanish influence within the Netherlands, particularly as the Netherlands was one of the key trading partners for England at this time as well, and that proved to be costly. Secondly, he wanted to launch a naval attack on Spain and therefore capture gold from Spanish ships on their return from the Americas. So he's also supporting piracy here. Now, Charles requested a war expenditure of £1 million in the 1625 Parliament, bearing in mind the most that James ever requested was £600,000, and that was proved to be quite extravagant. Now, Charles refused to explain what he intended to do with this money if it was granted, and therefore Parliament came back with a counter offer and said, we will not give you £1 million in subsidies for your war, however we will grant you £140,000. And this angered Charles, bearing in mind he's not very good at communicating, because he believes that this is going against his royal prerogative. He believes whatever he asks for, he should get. Now, all new monarchs, regardless of who they are given a right to something called tonnage and poundage. Now, this is a type of tax, particularly associated with the Navy, and this is offered to the Crown for life. But the Commons only granted this to Charles for 1 year, as opposed to life, and this further fueled the resentment between Charles and Parliament. Now, this was more so of an attack on Buckingham rather than Charles. But don't forget, Buckingham's been around since 1615. He's unpopular under James, and he's now got Charles under his wing. Now, Buckingham is Lord High Admiral. He's got quite a prestigious role within the Navy, and the tonnage and poundage was a tax for naval protection. So this was more of an attack against Buckingham than Charles, but Charles doesn't see it this way, and that further fuels the tension between Crown and Parliament. Now, we have a couple of parliamentary meetings with the Crown in the late 1620s. So we have 1626, 28 and 29. 29 being the last one until we get to the personal rule. And these were further fueled by money as Charles continued to spend on foreign policy, so his wars abroad. Parliament continued to reject further subsidies, which meant Charles had to resort to royal prerogative to raise money, creating further tension with the political nation, because the political nation is saying, no, your debt was high anyway when you came into power in 1625, and you're further being excessive with your financial situation. Therefore, we will not give you any more money, and this creates tension with Charles because he needs to find money somehow, and he's doing it through illegal measures rather than doing it through Parliament. And as a result of that, By 1629, Charles was £2 million in debt. Bearing in mind that if we go back up to James's rule with the Great Contract, according to Cecil, the current expenditure was £511,000, but the crown debt was £280,000. Now, that's quite a low figure in comparison anyway, so Cecil may have manipulated the stats there. But in comparison to approximately £200,000 to £500,000 debt under James, Charles is now £2 million in debt. So we can see how excessive his campaigns abroad are and the impact it's having upon the kingdom financially, and the methods in which he goes about collecting this money further alienates Parliament and fuels that resentment between the crown and Parliament. Now, Charles also tries to gain money. So Charles had gained £140,000 in 1625, but continued to collect tonnage and poundage after the 1 year expiration date. So don't forget, this tonnage and poundage is offered for a lifetime for monarchies, but the Commons only grant it to Charles for 1 year. He bypasses that and continues to collect that tax illegally. Similarly, in 1626, the forced loan. This is probably the most infamous measure that Charles goes to try and gain funding. And Charles demanded this, which was the equivalent of 5 subsidies, so £350,000, due to potential war. So not a definite war, a potential war against France and Spain, and knowing he did not have Parliament's financial support. There was opposition to the loan, however, so 76 people were imprisoned for their refusal to pay the tax or the loan, and only 70% of the expected monies from this tax, so £267,000 out of the £350,000, was collected. So the forced loan is only a partial success for Charles. Now, 1628 Parliament, Charles, like his father, goes back to Parliament to request further funds, which shows that the forced loan did not meet his financial expectations. But they were unwilling to negotiate with the Crown unless they agreed to something called the Petition of Right, which challenged the idea of divine right of kings, opposed unlawful imprisonment due to those imprisoned from refusal to pay the forced loan, and martial law in times of peace, i.e. when we are at peace and we are not at war, we do not need a standing army. If we do not need a standing army, we do not need to pay wages to soldiers, and this is a way of reducing your revenue. And Charles again was angered by this and again dissolved Parliament until he goes back to them again in 1629, which is to do with another matter other than financial reasons. So 1628 is the last time that we have this Parliament versus Crown showdown over finances, but we can understand why Parliament was slightly hesitant given the extravagant spending of Charles's father James and the further excessive spending of Charles.